The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill.
Evolution. An evolutionary boast. In the theory of natural selection, we have the key to the question of all questions, to the great enigma of the place of man in nature and of his natural development. The possibility of giving a mechanical explanation of organic nature was not seen until Darwin provided a solid foundation for the theory of a descent. Haeckel. The facts of the case. Can the doctrine of evolution be accepted by a Christian? It depends on the kind and the amount of evolution he is asked to accept. No Christian can accept evolution of the extreme Darwinian or Haeckelian type. But these are not the only forms of evolutionary theory. Certain moderate systems of evolution have been adopted by scientists who are sincere Christians, and some of whom are Catholics. It is plain that any theory of evolution that denies creation or the spirituality and immortality of the human soul is directly opposed to Christian truth. By evolution in general is meant a development or transformation, as when a seed evolves into a plant or a tadpole into a frog. But we are concerned here with the evolution of whole kinds or classes of beings into other kinds or classes. The reader needs hardly be informed that plants and animals are brought under an elaborate system of classification. The animal and vegetable kingdoms are each divided into sub-kingdoms, these again into classes, classes into orders, orders into families, families into genera, and genera into species. The species has been generally regarded as the unit. It may, however, have its subspecies, and the subspecies has been regarded by some naturalists as the unit. In the present state of biological science, the term species is a word of more or less vague import, and animals have been divided into species in a way that can hardly be regarded as scientific, the species being determined mainly by some peculiarity of structure, as for instance in the teeth of quadrupeds or in the bills of birds, and in the assigning of the species being often dependent on the peculiar knowledge of individual investigators. The results, however, of such unscientific classification need present no obstacle to our readers getting at the gist of evolutionary systems. The evolution controversy is chiefly concerned with the origin of species. Did all the known species of animals and plants exist as such originally, or have they been evolved from some primitive type or types? Did the dog, the wolf, and the jackal, which today are considered as distinct species of the genus Canis, always exist as distinct species, or have they been all three evolved from one type of animal, which was neither dog, wolf, nor jackal? Evolutionists hold that the present species have been evolved from primitive types. Their extreme opponents deny that there is any evolution of species. Evolutionary theories. The beginnings of evolutionary theories may be seen in the writings of Buffon, Treviranus, the poet and savant Goethe, and Erasmus, grandfather of Charles Darwin. But Lamarck, born 1744, is generally regarded as the father of modern evolutionary science. He insisted much on the effect of environment in developing or destroying the habits and propensities and even the organs of animals. The variations thus produced were perpetuated by heredity. Geoffroy St. Hilaire, a contemporary of Lamarck's, held the mutability of species, and among other points of his system was the theory that environment could produce sudden changes in the specific characters of the embryo. The theories of Lamarck and St. Hilaire made small impression on the scientific world compared with that produced by the theory of Charles Robert Darwin. Darwinism. In 1858, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who had been each working independently on the same lines, agreed to present themselves to the scientific world as the joint authors of a new system of evolution. Each read a paper on the subject before the Linnaean Society on the same day. The following year, 1859, Darwin explained his theory at greater length in his Origin of the Species. The distinct feature of the system was the law of natural selection. The phrase was suggested by what is known as artificial selection, a process familiar to cultivators and breeders. When a gardener wishes to develop some valuable quality in his roses or his chrysanthemums, he selects for planting the best of the seeds from flowers possessing that quality. Following a like process for successive generations of the species, he will finally succeed in developing what is regarded as a new variety. Now, according to Darwin, something analogous takes place in nature. By a sort of natural selection, certain peculiarities in animals and plants are propagated and developed, till after the lapse of ages, not only new varieties, but even new species are produced. But how is this law brought into operation? It is brought into operation by the struggle for existence. Animals and plants have a tendency to multiply much more rapidly than nature can supply them with the means of subsistence. Hence the struggle for life, which some individuals survive, but which others do not. In the case of successful ones, what is their secret of their success? It must be, says Darwin, in the possession of some natural advantage, though it be slight keener vision, for instance, or greater strength of wing, which makes them superior to their fellows. It must consist radically in some variation from the normal type of structure. Now these beneficial variations will be propagated by generation, and thus it comes to pass that as nature is always selecting from the best, the favorable variations will become more and more pronounced, and the animal or plant will diverge more and more from the original type. Finally, after many generations, an entirely new species will have been produced. Darwin's conclusions covered the whole range of animal and vegetable life. Even man in his early origins was not excluded from the operation of natural selection. Man, he tells us, is but a higher type of animal, which has arrived at its present superior condition by passing through a long series of transformations. He is in fact only a highly educated ape, whose superior intelligence is due to the ages of experience acquired in the school of adversity. Darwin obliterates the hard and fast line that has ever been drawn between human intelligence and animal instinct. With him it is a question of degree rather than of kind. What we call instinct only needs development to be converted into intelligence. No pure Darwinist can consistently hold that man possesses a spiritual soul essentially different from the soul of a brute. How seriously Darwin took home to himself his theory that ape intelligence and human intelligence are not essentially different is illustrated by the sudden check always put upon his thoughts about the Creator, by the reflection, "What can an ape know about such high things?" See Darwin. Ideas borrowed from Lamarck and Buffon were eventually grafted onto the original theory by Darwin as the result of reflection and observation. Nevertheless, natural selection is the great distinctive feature of the system by which it must either stand or fall. And now, what is the verdict passed upon pure Darwinism by natural science and theology? Quote, "Whatever services may have been rendered to the study of natural history by the principle of natural selection, it has been found to be notably defective as a key to the secret of the transformation of species, and many leading scientists now regard natural selection as only a subordinate factor in the process. The internal origin of useful variations tending to the realization of nature's designs is neglected in the theory, and the necessary accumulation of variations making for greater perfection of structure is not demonstrated. Darwinism can offer no explanation of certain elaborate formations which could have never passed through an elaborate struggle for existence. The sight of a peacock's tail always gave a painful shock to Darwin's evolutionary creed. Darwinism made too little account of environment and isolation, as well as of possible changes in the embryo. It knew nothing of sudden transformations, such as the Mendelian system has made us familiar with. These and other defects have shattered the faith of more than one devout Darwinian, and, indirectly, have given a stimulus to the inquiry in other directions. The history of Darwinism furnishes one of the most impressive instances of usurpation in the domain of thought, followed by reaction and rebellion. Encountering at first intense opposition from older scientists, it soon won its way to favor among the young and enthusiastic. Its right to preeminence was loudly and intolerantly asserted. Finally, within a decade or two after the appearance of The Origin of Species, Darwinism was completely in the ascendant. Its influence was no longer confined to scientific circles, but was felt in the popular lecture hall and even in the elementary school. The phrases set afloat by it, struggle for existence, survival of the fittest, the missing link, had now become household words. Such was Darwinism within the recollection of many of us, but today Darwinism is dethroned. Evolution in some form has possibly come to stay, but Darwinism and evolution are no longer regarded as identical by many of the leaders of scientific thought. The gradual decline of Darwinism is neatly and pointedly described by Edward von Hartmann. In the 60s of the past century, he tells us, the opposition of the older group of savants to the Darwinian hypothesis was supreme. In the 70s, the idea began to gain ground rapidly in all cultured countries. In the 80s, Darwin's influence was at its height and exercised an almost absolute control over technical research. In the 90s, for the first time, a few timid expressions of doubt and opposition were heard, and these gradually swelled into a great chorus of voices, aiming at the overthrow of the Darwinian theory. In the first decade of the 20th century, it has become apparent that the days of Darwinism are numbered. Among its latest opponents are such savants as Eimer, Gustav Wolff, de Vries, Hooke, von Wellstein, Fleischmann, Rank, and many others. See Literary Digest, January 23, 1904. For a confirmation of this testimony, we need but to turn to the partial list of opponents of Darwinism furnished by Father Gerard in his valuable work, The Old Riddle and the Nearest Answer, page 199. A list in which occur such names as de Quatrefages, Blanchard, Wigand, Wolff, Hamann, Pauli, Dreich, Plate, Hertwig, Heer, Colliker, Eimer, von Hartmann, Schild, Du Bois Raymond, Virchow, Nageli, Schaffenhausen, Fechner, Jacob Diebolder, Huber, Joseph Rank, and von Bauer. As to the Darwinian derivation of man from the ape, not a few of Darwin's followers have parted company with him on that point. His colleague in the first propounding of the theory of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, was a steady adherent, on scientific grounds, of the doctrine of the spirituality and the divine origin of the human soul. The overthrow of natural selection is not the overthrow of evolution, but still even the fate of natural selection is matter for rejoicing to all Christian believers. To those whose faith is easily disturbed by supposed scientific truths, it is well that an object lesson has been furnished showing how easily a scientific guess may pass current for a scientific truth, and how easily a timorous soul may be frightened with false fire. Haeckel's system. Darwin's theory, bold as it is in some respects tame compared with Haeckel's. And yet Haeckel's is only a revamping of ancient systems of philosophy which have had their day. It contains, however, one element of originality. According to Haeckel, there is one universal, all-controlling law of nature, the law of substance. How did he discover it? There was no need of discovery for a man of Haeckel's well-known ready invention. He simply took two laws accepted by the scientific world, the indestructibility of matter and the conservation of energy, and framed them into one. Why he should have called it a law, or why a law of substance, he would have found it difficult to explain. He sums up the universe and its history in two words, matter and energy, though energy is only a quality of matter. As the system reduces all things to one, it is a species of monism, from the Greek monos, single. By the law of substance, we are told, all things have been evolved from the minute particles of matter that once constituted the then formless universe. The process has been a purely mechanical one. Nebulous matter has been shaped into revolving orbs. The mineral kingdom has sprung into existence, and then in succession the vegetable and animal, closing with man, who with all his achievements, with his civilization and religion, is reducible, like all things else, to the one formula, matter and energy. God, providence, creation, spiritual and immortal soul, free will, moral responsibility, all this is swept aside, and in its place is erected a law of blind necessity whose operation is inevitable and irreversible. The boldness of this doctrine is only surpassed by the reckless indifference of its defender, if defender he can be called, to the necessity of demonstrating what is so confidently asserted. A certain species of quiet assumption is the policy of Haeckel and his school, and this is the secret of their success with the unthinking multitude. Problems, before which the world's greatest minds have halted from a sense of their inherent difficulty, are serenely ignored by these mystics of pseudoscience, who substitute a sort of scientific faith or scientific intuition for bona fide research and general scientific demonstration. Such is the theory of evolution proclaimed as scientific law by Professor Haeckel in his Riddle of the Universe, a work in which the author steps down from the professional chair and appeals to the crowd, and that with no little success, notwithstanding the fact that his methods, his assertions, and his professional conduct generally have been indignantly repudiated by a large number of leading German scientists. If our readers would like to see a sample portrait of the class of scientists who have thus degraded themselves before the crowd, we would ask them to turn to the article entitled Haeckel. After reading it, they will agree with us that the following verdict passed upon his pretensions by Professor Paulsen is comparatively mild. Quote, "What I propose showing is not more, nor yet less, than this, that as a philosopher Haeckel is not to be taken seriously." End quote. It would take a treatise on rational philosophy and another one on natural science to refute one half of the assumptions and false assertions that abound in Haeckel's books. Many of them have been repudiated by leading scientists in their criticism of pure Darwinism. We have taken special pains elsewhere, see spontaneous generation, to show that one essential link in the continuous chain of causes and effects required by Haeckelin evolution is wanting. The transition from the no-life period on Earth to the period of life cannot be accounted for except by either creation or by spontaneous generation. By Haeckel and his school, spontaneous generation is simply assumed as a fact, although there is no warrant for the assumption either in the ordinary experience or in science. In recent years, evolutionists have followed very divergent paths. Some have not yet renounced their loyalty to the old ensign of natural selection. Some have been harking back to Lamarckism. Others have busied themselves with the study of the embryo, with a view at getting at the conditions for the transformation of species. Still another group are proving experimentally that new species may be produced suddenly, and hold that in the past nature has so produced them, not however capriciously, but by virtue of an internal principle and by fixed law. Evolution and Christianity. As evolution and Christianity meet on common ground, to wit, the origin of the material world and of man, it is desirable to know whether and to what extent they can dwell in their peace. In the first place, what should be the attitude of a Christian man of science toward the general idea of evolution of the species? Impartial investigators have found a mass of facts which they regard as evidence of at least a limited evolution of species. There is nothing to prevent a Christian from entering this field and exploring it to the utmost. The certain and solid results of scientific research will never be found conflicting with Christian truth, for truth can never be at variance with truth. Necessarily, Catholic theologians have been uncompromising in their hostility to pure Darwinism, and at first they looked with disfavor, to say the least, on any and every theory of evolution of species. But now that scientific thought has been showing a tendency to right itself after a period of storm and stress, there is some prospect of reconciliation between theology and evolution. We have a typical example of the moderate Christian evolutionist in the distinguished German entomologist Father Waschmann, S.J., who inclines to the theory that the present countless species of plants and animals have been derived from a comparatively small number of species, natural species, he calls them, which were the direct product of creation. He thus leaves the Christian doctrine of creation untouched. To the believer in creation, he says, it is a matter of indifference whether the hare and the rabbit or the horse and the ass are related in origin. If the old idea of fixedness of the species should be supplanted by the new idea of derivation by descent, the power and wisdom of the Creator would not be the less glorified. Rather, they would be the more glorified, by reason of the Creators having implanted in organic natures potentialities which enable them to unfold ever new forms of organic life without the need of any further special intervention of creative power. Whenever there is question of accepting or rejecting any evolutionary theory, we must of course draw the line at every point where the theory clashes with the unmistakable Catholic teaching. An evolution that entirely excludes creation is both unchristian and unscientific. A theory that denies that the world was made in 6 days is to be rejected, and yet we are not forbidden to interpret the 6 days of the Bible as 6 very long periods of time. The original text of Genesis does not exclude that interpretation, and in case science succeeds in demonstrating that long periods of time must have elapsed between the formation of the earth and the creation of man, there will be nothing in the Bible to contradict that demonstration. Even the postulate of millions of years, which has so often been put forward, could be safely granted. The opposite extreme in the interpretation of 6 days is illustrated by St. Augustine's opinion, or at least by the view that he inclines to, that God created all things at one time and the same moment, and that the 6 days only indicate 6 grades of perfection, or 6 orders of created things. As regards the origin of man, we must, in the first place, distinguish between body and soul. Catholic teaching and sound philosophy require us to hold that man's soul is spiritual, and is therefore essentially different from the soul of a brute. Hence, no evolution of the soul of an animal can produce intelligence, in the right sense of the word. Hence, no Catholic can admit the evolution of the human soul. As to the body of man, Catholics are bound to accept the inspired statement of the Book of Genesis 2:7. "The Lord God formed man of the slime of the earth." As to the manner in which he formed his body, perhaps some latitude of opinion is permitted. St. Augustine, whilst regarding the question as wrapped in mystery, is very loath to consider the Almighty as fashioning the body of man in the way in which an artist models his figures in clay. In one passage he speaks of something like a preparation and predetermination of the human body before the formation of the complete man, in what he calls the primordial forms or elements, in rationibus primordialibus. Certain Catholic authorities do not see any repugnance, so far as Christian doctrine is concerned, in the idea that the body of the first man should have passed through a number of stages of development, viz., inorganic, vegetable, and finally animal life. On this view we shall not presume to pass judgment. It seems to be as far removed as it safely can be from the more natural and obvious interpretation of the text. Quote, "The Lord God formed man of the slime of the earth, and breathed into his face the breath of life," end quote. But it may, nonetheless, be defensible. It, of course, excludes the rational soul from the range of evolution, for that every Christian theory of evolution must do. To return, in conclusion, to Professor Haeckel's views, it is not, after all, so evident that in the theory of natural selection we have the key to the question of all questions, to the great enigma of the place of man in nature and of his natural development.
Faith, a misconception. Faith is a groping in the dark. It is unreasonable to admit anything without evidence. To make an act of faith in the experiences of another is a thoughtless act, which afterward comes home to one in the shape of pestering doubts. Harnack, Dogmengeschichte. The truth. To believe a thing is to accept it on the authority of another. If I should meet with a friend whom I knew to be truthful, and should be told by him that he had seen a certain person in a certain place and at a certain time, I should accept his statement without any hesitation. His honesty and his means of knowing the fact in question are a sufficient guarantee for the truth of his statement. This is an act of faith of the purely human kind. This human faith is as widespread as the human race. Credence is given to the assertions of trustworthy witnesses, and reasonably so. For a sincere and honest man who possesses a good pair of eyes and ears, and who tells me that he has recently seen a third party, conversed with him, and dined with him, may surely be believed, and would undoubtedly be believed by serious men. A judge receives the testimony of trustworthy witnesses without incurring the charge of thoughtlessness or levity. Religious faith holds as true what God has revealed. God, who has created human beings and conferred upon them the gift of speech, surely has it in his power to reveal a truth to one of their number. Should that man inform his fellow men of the revelation received, it will naturally require him to show his credentials. Should he confirm his teaching by genuine miracles, reasonable men will believe him, because they know that God will not confirm an untruthful statement by a miracle. What is taught is held as true because it is revealed by God, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. This is surely a reasonable basis for supernatural faith. If I admit nothing without intrinsic evidence, I repudiate all human faith. There is not a line of written history in which I can put any faith. The teaching art, especially as applied to the young, must be thrown aside, for it rests on the principle that the young cannot be taught unless they have an implicit reliance on the word of the teacher. As a rational being, I accept, in the first place, whatever is supported by intrinsic evidence. In the second place, I admit what another tells me if I am sure that my witness is truthful and possesses a knowledge of the fact. To do otherwise would be irrational. By those who deny the possibility of miracles, supernatural religious faith is, of course, regarded as folly. The real folly lies in the denial of miracles, for if there is a God, he has the power of intervening in his own creation. Professor Harnack repudiates religious faith because he repudiates miracles. He repudiates miracles because he fails to see all that is implied in the idea of an omnipotent God. He holds that God made the world out of nothing, but surely, one who has made the universe by the simple fiat of his almighty power can just as easily give sight to the blind, or raise the dead to life, or feed 4,000 men with 5 small loaves. Consistency is a jewel which we can hardly congratulate the professor on possessing. See the article entitled Miracles, in which the question both of the possibility and of the fact is fully discussed.
Free love. A socialist plea. The only true marriage is a marriage founded in love. When love ceases, it is immoral for the parties to remain united. Marriage is a private compact in which no one but the married couple should have any say. The answer. Such is the socialist idea of marriage as defended by Bebel. How the leaders of socialism can presume to describe any act as either moral or immoral is beyond our comprehension. Socialist leaders are atheists and materialists. See Socialism 2, 3, and 4. And being such, they have no basis for their so-called morality. But we can let that pass. It is convenient for socialists to use a respectable old term with a new meaning. Socialists affect to regard as calumny the accusation that they wish to abolish marriage, but here, again, they are using an old word in a new meaning. In all civilized countries, the word marriage has conveyed the idea of a permanent union between man and wife. Even the non-Catholic sects that permit divorce on account of grave sin regard marriage as permanent in the intention of the parties before the contract is made. "Till death do us part" is the phrase used at the marriage ceremony. Socialists may apply the term to the transient and evanescent thing which they are fain to establish in the place of genuine marriage, but they cannot expect us to follow suit. It is plain from the objection placed at the top of the page that a socialist marriage and a Christian marriage have little in common and are in many points opposed. Christian marriage is permanent. A socialistic marriage may be dissolved when love has vanished. Christian marriage is a divine institution, the conditions of which are fixed by divine law. Socialistic marriage is subject to the arbitrary control of man. In Christian marriage, the wife is subject to the husband. Ephesians verse 22. In the above objection, the independence of the wife is implied. The genuine Christian idea of marriage makes it one of the 7 sacraments of the Church, and thus places it under the Church's jurisdiction. Socialism makes it a private affair in which no one is allowed to interfere. The dominance of socialism would, therefore, mean the destruction of Christian marriage, and with all the destruction of the Christian family. All family would, indeed, be more than imperiled. But the evil would not end here. Marriage under socialism would be nothing short of the reign of free love, with little or no restraint placed upon its tyranny. In the first place, under socialism, marriage, being a purely private affair, would have no legal status. It would be wholly dependent on the caprice of human passion, and human passion would feel itself free to go foraging wherever it pleased. There would be no force of public opinion or public sense of decency to keep it within bounds. On the contrary, public opinion would encourage a change of partners when affection had changed. No effectual obstacle, in a word, could be interposed to prevent love from seeking and finding its object. If this is not free love, differing but little from the promiscuous pairing of birds and beasts, the term has no meaning. Even if a socialist marriage had a certain legal status, and the marital union, as long as it lasted, were protected from invasion by a third party, none the less the way would be thrown upon to an invader through the affections, which would reign supreme in all such matters in the socialist commonwealth. Imagine a concrete case. Tom and Lizzie have taken a fancy to each other. It is only a fancy, but that doesn't matter. They are socialists and are willing to try their chances. And straightway they join hands in wedlock, agreeing to remain together as long as they like one another. A month or two later, Lizzie meets with a pair of eyes more attractive than Tom's, and her liking for Tom begins to wane. But Tom's liking for Lizzie remains unchanged. When the crisis comes, he pleads his heartfelt affection and argues against a separation. But the matter is soon arranged. They are both true socialists, and they part in the true socialistic spirit. Lizzie, meantime, has felt small commiseration for Tom, as he knows he will soon be within reach of recovered happiness. Is society willing to inaugurate this state of things? We think not. Certainly, if it once had a taste of it, it would soon rebound from the tyranny of free and untrammeled sensual passion. It is not a question of free love among angels, but of free love among human beings possessed of strong animal instincts, the unrestrained indulgence of which would sink man to the level of the brute. The principle that marriage should cease when love ceases is unfortunately held by many who are not socialists, and, indeed, for one who has lost sight of the divine origin of marriage, and who is at the same time capable of seeing only one aspect of a situation, it may be quite natural to advocate the separation of man and wife when mutual affection has ceased, and the seeking of marital happiness by either of the parties through a second alliance. But one does not need to be much of a social philosopher to see the evil effects that would be wrought upon society by making the permanence of marriage depend upon the vagaries of human affection. To see, among other things, how the family would be destroyed, how offspring would suffer, how populations would diminish, and how all the nobler aims and activities of life would be paralyzed. The perfection of marriage does, it is true, depend on the perfection of love, and conjugal love, under obedience to divine law and under the best Christian influences, is made as perfect as anything can be made in this life. And even where love has cooled, conjugal amity can, by the aid of sacramental grace, be preserved. Where much suffering is endured by one of the parties in consequence of the guilty acts of the other, both human and divine law has provided for separation, whilst the best interests of society, as well as of the individuals concerned, forbid the complete severance of the bond of matrimony. Even those who are beyond the reach of sacramental grace can, by the aid of the ordinary graces vouchsafed to all classes of men, overcome the difficulties incident to the married state, especially if they live according to their lights and observe the natural law.
Freemasonry. Objection. Why is the Church opposed to Freemasonry without any distinction? Whatever may be the aims of Masonry on the continent of Europe, there is certainly nothing hostile to the Catholic Church or to religion generally in Anglo-American Masonry, whose object is mutual aid among the members of the fraternity and the promotion of the spirit of brotherhood throughout the world. The answer. The Catholic Church is opposed to Freemasonry because there is a solidarity between Masons of all countries. Freemasonry is international in the sense that there is a mutual recognition of Masons among themselves as belonging to one general fraternity, that there is a systematic maintenance of correspondence between the Masonic lodges, that the Masons of the world meet in international convention, that they have a common literature, and common signs, passwords, and symbols. But what is more to the point is that Anglo-American Masonry has long since been either absorbed or dominated by Masonry of the Scottish type, which is essentially naturalistic and anti-Christian, has a religion of its own, and is, in general, one of the worst forms of Freemasonry. This solidarity is openly acknowledged by leading Masonic authorities. Brother Pike, for instance, who is an American oracle of Freemasonry, writes Official Bulletin, 1885, Volume 7, 29, when the journal in London, which speaks of the Freemasonry of the Grand Lodge of England, depreciatingly protested that the English Freemasonry was innocent of the charges preferred by the papal bull, Encyclical 1884, against Freemasonry, when it declared that English Freemasonry had no opinions, political or religious, and that it did not in the least degree sympathize with the loose opinions and extravagant utterances of part of the continental Freemasonry, it was very justly and very conclusively checkmated by the Romish organs with the reply, "It is idle for you to protest. You are Freemasons, and you recognize them as Freemasons. You give them countenance, encouragement, and support, and you are jointly responsible with them, and cannot shirk that responsibility." Quoted by Gruber, Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 5, 9, page 778. What is said here of English Masonry would be generally regarded as applicable to American Masonry. Pike is only one of the many authorities that acknowledge the oneness of Freemasonry throughout the world. American Freemasonry was at first comparatively innocent, but the Scottish Rite, since its importation into the United States at the close of the American Revolution, has gradually made its way to supremacy. Its hostility to the papacy and to monarchy is acknowledged by Masonic writers. Its 30th degree is distinguished by its practice of trampling on the Pope's tiara and the royal crown. It professes a belief in the great architect of the world, but discards all received modes of worshiping him. It has, in fact, a religion of its own, a religion which is paraded as antedating all the religions now in vogue, the primitive religion practiced by Noah, and others long before the advent of Moses and the Mosaic Law. That Freemasonry has a religion of its own was rather strangely and surprisingly acknowledged in 1903 by the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of the state of New York. A certain Robert Kopp, having been expelled from the fraternity, appealed against the action of his brethren to the civil courts of the state, and received an unfavorable judgment, first from the Supreme Court, and afterward from the appellate division of the same court. One of the strong points made by the Grand Lodge was that a Masonic society was a religious body, possessing all the privileges of any religious association. The following is an extract from the briefs and points presented by counsel for the Grand Lodge at the second trial. The right to membership in the Masonic fraternity is very much like the right to membership in a church. Each requires a candidate for admission to subscribe to certain articles of religious belief as an essential prerequisite to membership. Each requires a member to conduct himself thereafter in accordance with certain religious principles. Each requires its members to adhere to certain doctrines of belief and action. The precepts contained in the Landmarks and the Charges of a Freemason, see pages 92 to 100 of the Book of Constitutions, edition of 1900, formulate a creed so thoroughly religious in character that it may well be compared with the formally expressed doctrine of many a denominational church. The Masonic fraternity may, therefore, be quite properly regarded as a religious society, and the long line of decisions holding that a religious society shall have sole and exclusive jurisdiction to determine matters of membership should be deemed applicable to the Masonic fraternity. There is so much trumpery speculation on religious subjects in Masonic writings, so much is made of the meaning of arbitrary symbols, which only a few adepts are supposed to be capable of understanding, so strong is the tendency to go back to ancient superstitions, which to a great extent disappeared at the dawn of Christianity, that the plain man of sense is tempted to regard it all as moonshine or as the purest humbug. But whatever may be said of the sanity or of the sincerity of Masonic science, it is, after all, only one phase of a tendency, so marked in our day, to return to paganism in thought, sentiment, and action. The Masonic conception of the architect of the universe is anything but the Christian conception of God, and is distinctly pagan. And yet how many has it not deceived outside the ranks of the fraternity? Though, even within the order, as we shall see later, the interpretation of words, symbols, and allegories, given in the lower degrees, is part and parcel of a system of deception practiced on the initiated themselves. The following clear statement of Brother Pike is enough to show the attitude of Freemasonry toward Christianity and all other forms of religion. The italics are ours. Masonry, says Pike, propagates no creed except its own most simple and sublime one, taught by nature and reason. There has never been a false religion in the world. The permanent, one, universal religion is written in visible nature and explained by the reason, and is completed by the wise analogies of faith. Gruber, Ibid. In the Masonic view, no religion is false, because the rites and dogmas of all religions, Christianity included, are at least the symbols of the real truths of which Freemasonry is the fortunate, perhaps the sole, possessor. Christianity, Buddhism, Mohammedanism are but husks enclosing the precious kernel of Masonic truth. Surely there is enough in this to repel any Christian who has the smallest knowledge of his faith. If, therefore, any reader of this book should light upon a member of the craft who approaches him in that politely cautious way which is learned among the brethren, and assures him that there is nothing in English or American Masonry that ought to shock a Christian, he may set it down as certain, supposing the Mason's veracity, either that he, like Brother Pike, is speaking in some transcendental Masonic sense, or that his assurances are based on ignorance. He may not be enough of an adept to know what anyone may know by consulting the acknowledged authorities of the order. As likely as not, he belongs to the class of Blue Masons, or low-degree Masons, who pride themselves on initiation in some grand this or that, without knowing whither they are going to be led in their possible ascent toward the top. The blue degrees, says Pike, are but the outer court or portico of the temple. Part of the symbols are displayed there to the initiate, but he is intentionally misled by false interpretations. It is not intended that he shall understand them, but it is intended that he shall imagine he understands them. Their true explication is reserved for the adepts, the princes of Masonry, quoted by Pruce in A Study in American Freemasonry. Masons, says Brother Oliver, may be 50 years masters of the chair, and yet not learn the secret of the brotherhood. Gruber, Ibid. It is for the adept, says Pike, to understand the meaning of the symbols. Ibid. And Oliver adds, brethren high in rank and office are often unacquainted with the elementary principles of the science. Ibid. It is a common pretense of Masons in their discourses on Masonic science that they are the successors of the ancient adepts in pagan mysteries. Such is Freemasonry in its attitude toward religion. Masons themselves acknowledge that the sympathies of Anglo-American Masonry go out to the anti-Catholic and anti-Christian revolutions of continental Europe. In countries like Great Britain and the United States, representative Masons may detest the Church as much as their European brethren, but either they cannot or dare not give expression to their detestation in overt acts of hostility, but they are in perfect sympathy with all the plots of Masonry in European countries against the freedom of the Church against the religious orders, and against Catholic education. The aims and machinations of Freemasonry on the continent of Europe are well known, and no very extra pains seem to be taken to conceal them. Father Gruber, from whom we have been quoting and who is a master of the subject, furnishes an abundance of evidence from the bulletin in the Compte Rendu of the Grand Orient of France, showing the extent and character of Masonic anti-religious activities in France. It is clear from these sources that French Freemasonry aims at getting everyone and everything under its control. Que personne ne bougera plus en France, à deux de nous. I said in the Assembly of 1898, says Massey, one of its official orators, that it is the supreme duty of Freemasonry to interfere each day more and more in political and profane struggles. Success in the anti-clerical combat is in a large measure due to Freemasonry, for it is its spirit, its program, its methods that have triumphed. If the bloc has been established, this is owing to Freemasonry and to the discipline learned in the lodges. The measures we have now to urge are the separation of church and state, and a law concerning instruction. Let us put our trust in the word of our brother Combes. We need vigilance, and above all, mutual confidence, if we are to accomplish our work, as yet unfinished. The Republic must rid itself of the religious congregations, sweeping them off by a vigorous stroke. Even worse aims than these are manifested by Senator Delpech, President of the Grand Orient. The triumph of the Galilean, he tells his brethren, has lasted 20 centuries, but now he, footnote, we have reproduced the capitalization of the author, although contrary to the canons of good taste and general usage, end footnote, dies in his turn. The mysterious voice announcing, to Julian the Apostate, the death of Pan, today announces the death of the impostor God, who promised an era of justice and peace to those who believed in him. The illusion has lasted a long time. The mendacious God is now disappearing in his turn. He passes away to join in the dust of ages the other divinities of India, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, who saw so many deceived creatures prostrate before their altars. Brother Masons, we rejoice to state that we are not without our share in this overthrow of the false prophets. The Romish Church, founded on the Galilean myth, began to decay rapidly from the very day on which the Masonic Association was established. Gruber, Ibid. The declarations of Italian Freemasonry are no less clear as to the aims of the Brotherhood. The Rivista Massoneria Italiana, an official organ of Italian Masonry, has repeated avowals of the ultimate intentions of the order. It tells us that the end it has set before it is the destruction of monarchy and of all thrones, and that the means to the end is the annihilation of the papacy and of all revealed religion. 1889, page 4, 1886, page 378. A thorough secularization of the state and of the schools, as well as the destruction of the Christian family and of all authority. Ibid. It informs us that all revealed religion is poison to the people. 1890, page 159. That all instruction in any kind of catechism in the schools should be prohibited. 1892, page 231. And that to the noble task of bringing all this about, Freemasons the world over are devoting their energies. 1892, page 222, 241. The platform of Freemasonry is clearly set forth in the Masonic publication entitled The Papal Church and Freemasonry, a Masonic answer to the Papal Encyclical, Leipzig. Its aims are these: the demolishing of all church authority, the entire separation of church and school, the abolishing of religious instruction, the de-Christianizing of family life, and the emancipation of woman. This is the sort of thing to which Anglo-American Masonry lends its sympathy. Freemasonry is one and united throughout the world, and everywhere it is under the same ecclesiastical ban. Catholics need hardly be told that for them membership in any Masonic organization means excommunication from the Church. Masonry, therefore, whether it be British or American or continental, is not simply an institution whose object is mutual aid and the establishment of a true brotherhood among men. Its purposes are deeper and more important than these. It aims at universal dominion. It aims at crushing out supernatural religion and paganizing what is left. Even the benevolent purposes it makes profession of are anything but benevolent as regards the higher interests both of individuals and of society. Mutual assistance among Masons is not confined to their helping one another to get on in the world. It has a wider sphere and extends to acts that involve a betrayal of honor and an infringement of duty. The claims of country in the hour of strife are little regarded by the Mason when opposed to the interests of a member of the craft. So at least the following promise of the 30th degree would seem to imply. I pledge myself never to harm a knight Kadosh, 30th degree, either by word or deed. I vow that if I find him as a foe in the battlefield, I will save his life when he makes me the sign of distress, and that I will free him from prison and confinement upon land or water. The inexorable laws of war themselves, says an official orator of the Grand Orient of France, quoted by Father Gruber, Ibid, had to bend before Freemasonry, which is perhaps the most striking proof of its power. A sign sufficed to stop the slaughter. The combatants threw away their arms, embraced each other fraternally, and at once became friends and brethren, as their oaths prescribed. The Royal Archmason swears, I will assist a companion Royal Archmason when I see him engaged in any difficulty, and will espouse his cause so as to extricate him from the same, whether he be right or wrong. Gruber, Ibid. The fraternal spirit in Masonry is plainly that of a close corporation devoted to self at the expense of right and justice. Another aspect of Masonic brotherhood should make it contemptible to the initiated themselves. Have we not seen Masons confessing that those in the lower ranks are the dupes of those in the higher? That the secrets of this happy brotherhood are known only to a very few? Absolute obedience, solemnly sworn, and extending to every possible command, is not the condition of a brother making a covenant with brothers. It is the condition of a slave who has placed himself under the yoke of tyrannical masters. And yet Masons are proud to exhibit the badges of their servitude, as though these were the insignia of a privileged class of mortals. Privileged they certainly are in the opportunities afforded them for material gain and social advancement, advantages, however, which most men of honor would scorn to purchase by associating themselves with a narrow clique, ruled by a still narrower one at the top, to say nothing of the sacrifice involved to things that ought to be dearer to them than any temporal advantage whatsoever. See Secret Societies.
Free thought. A free-thinking reverie. A free thinker is the only one who knows what freedom means. He has burst the fetters of religious servitude, the most galling of all fetters, especially such as the Roman Church binds upon her subjects. The truth. There is a sort of superstition attaching to the use of the expression free thought. Is freedom the one thing necessary in thought? The great object of the mind's craving is truth. The possession of truth is the end and aim of all its activity. Freedom is but a condition for the exercise of its activity in the pursuit of truth. An aimless exercise of this activity is mental recklessness. On the other hand, the possession of truth, whether it be the result of free thinking or not, is the mind's one and only source of contentment. There is a healthy freedom of thought, but it can never be identified with that freedom which deliberately sets to work to change the conditions which nature and truth have set for the acquisition of knowledge. Truth is not a thing that starts into existence at our bidding. It is not dependent on us. Rather, we are dependent on it. Our declarations of independence do not extend to the realms of truth. There we are subjects, not sovereigns. This is the first lesson impressed upon us, without our knowing it, when reason begins to dawn. The youth must learn, and not kick at the goads by way of asserting his freedom of thought. Imagine a schoolboy refusing to submit his mind to the truths of a multiplication table. And yet, a similar independence in mature minds is sometimes considered wisdom. The truths of the multiplication table, though simply worded, are absolute and eternal truths. But may there not be other truths equally absolute and eternal? Truths bearing on our origin, our destiny, our relations to the Supreme Being? And may there not be a means of getting to those truths? Is there not a presumption in their favor? Nay, more than a presumption, when so many of the world's greatest minds have admitted them. It is notorious that nearly all freethinkers begin their thinking with the assumption that all these truths are myths, or that if they are more than myths, there is no way of reaching them. Thus, they actually restrict their freedom and throw away a clue to the discovery of truth. They may be likened to a man who makes a long and fruitless search for an object he has mislaid, and all because he has too lightly assumed that there is no use in searching for it in a certain place, the very place where it happens to be. And yet, the truths thus lightly set aside are of tremendous importance, bearing as they do upon eternity. True freedom of thought begets an open-mindedness that excludes from its consideration no possible source of truth. It furthermore makes an effort, as a leading apologist remarks, to remove from the mind all influences that do not make for genuine knowledge, either because they are not fact, or have no basis in fact, or because they are mere imaginings, or habitual but erroneous impressions, or false or superficial interpretations of the perceptions of sense, or of other sources of information. If by freedom of thought is meant a freedom from assumptions and preconceived ideas, it is one of the conditions for arriving at the truth. The precise opposite of this healthy freedom of thought is the besetting sin of most of the anti-Christian scientists of the day. Materialism, especially that of the Hegelian stamp, deliberately shuts out one possible source of truth by assuming that nothing exists but what can be perceived by the senses, that all things are either matter or energy, and that energy is only a quality of matter. What possible grounds can be alleged for such an assumption? Neither observation nor experiment can furnish any foundation for it. Must we conclude that the wish is father to the thought? No one can read the works of the free-thinking Haeckel and not notice, on the one hand, what a tissue of reckless assumptions they are, and on the other, with what relentless hatred the author assails the notion of a soul, a God, a hereafter, without perceiving that he is a hater of religion first and a scientist after.
God's existence. An atheistic jibe. Theism, a belief in a personal God, would have us divide the world into earth and sky. Men run about the earth, and God is seated in the skies, whence he rules the earth. But astronomy steps in and removes the sky, and with it, the God who dwells in it. Astronomy has pushed the limits of the universe so far as to leave no room for a God. Schopenhauer. The answer. Schopenhauer has not said the last word on the subject. God is not the subject matter of astronomy or of any other physical science. It is not by the telescope that God is discovered, but by an instrument of a different order. The human mind, by means of reflection, can penetrate beyond the stars and discover the ultimate cause of all things. In maintaining the existence of God, we must remind the atheist of our day that we are not holding a brief for the existence of some obscure being whose worshippers are of yesterday and whose worship is being obtruded upon the intelligence of the world. A belief in God is the earliest and most constant fact in human history. Moreover, a belief in God has laid hold of countless intellects of the highest order. And yet today, the shallowest of minds brush it aside, as though it were one of those empty hypotheses that rise and disappear in a generation. Ah, but remember, says the atheist, those highly intellectual believers of the past weigh little in the balance today. They were ignorant of the science of our day, which is fatal to the doctrine of a personal God. But not so fast. A glance at another article in this work, Science and Faith, will reveal the fact that most of the great leaders of science in the 19th century were believers in a personal God. Science and atheism have indeed met in the same mind, but in our own age, considering the influences at work producing atheism and agnosticism, the fact that a man of science is without faith is neither more nor less surprising than that a merchant or a lawyer or an artist should be an unbeliever. The fact proves nothing as regards the necessary bearing of science on religion. The neglect of practical religion, lack of instruction, the dominion of passion over reason and grace, any of these facts in a man's life may account for his lapsing into atheism. The kind of science for which the present generation is mostly distinguished is that of the experimental sort. But what has experimental science produced that tells against the existence of a personal God? Experiment can never land us in a knowledge of ultimate causes. As soon as it reaches the outer confines of experience, it must hand over the work of investigation to rational philosophy. And who is not aware of the chaos that reigns in the philosophy of the day? Geological science has thrown some light upon the history of our globe, but it knows nothing of what went before. History and archaeology, in the hands of the atheist, have been wielded against a belief in God, and an attempt has been made to bring the infinite and eternal God down to the level of the national and tribal gods of the Gentiles. But the result has been to throw into greater relief the immense contrast between the one invisible and omnipotent God of the chosen people and the countless anthropomorphic figments of the pagan mind. The fact that so spiritual a conception of deity was carried down through the long ages of its history by a people surrounded on all sides by carnal-minded idolaters is itself no small proof of the existence of a God whose providence is the key to this historical anomaly. As to astronomical science, it has only exhibited a wider domain of creative power than was known to the ancients. God's world is larger than we had thought, but astronomy has not proved that he does not still hold it in the hollow of his hand. In a word, there is no science or other branch of knowledge that lends any support to the denial of a personal God. Atheism is generated either in minds that have never seriously and patiently examined into the evidence of God's existence, or in minds that have been warped by moral delinquency. Superficiality and narrowness of outlook are the dominant qualities of much philosophizing on the subject. The shallowness that begets atheism was well discerned by one of the wisest of modern minds. A little philosophy, says Bacon, inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion. For while the mind of man looketh upon second causes scattered, it may sometimes rest in them, and go no further. But when it beholdeth the chain of them confederate and linked together, it must needs fly to providence and deity. Essays, Atheism. We shall now proceed to unfold some of the arguments by which human reason has demonstrated the existence of a supreme being. As we are not writing a treatise, the argumentation cannot be exhaustive, but it will serve to show how by reason and reflection the invisible things of him, as St. Paul expresses it, are clearly seen from the creation of the world, being understood by the things that are made. Proofs of God's existence. The universe must have had a beginning. Therefore, it must have got its beginning from a being who himself had no beginning. Let us endeavor to bring out the force of this reasoning. First, as regards the material universe, things have come to their present condition by a series of changes. These changes are still observable on the largest scale. We see them in the processes of growth and decay. We notice too that one thing produces another, and that other a third. And there is evidence that such has been the case for ages. Hence, a series or rather many series of causes and effects coming down from a remote past. Now my reason tells me that such a chain of causation must have had a beginning. Such a series of causes and effects without a beginning is inconceivable. There must have been one first cause, and therefore one not caused by another but subsisting in and through itself. Let us throw a little light upon this conclusion by an illustration. My eyes are at this moment resting upon an oak tree. Let us designate it by the letter A. Now A is the offspring of another oak, B, which in turn owes its origin to C and so on, back to D, E, and the rest. Is the series infinite, that is to say, endless? Or is it composed of a finite number, one that can be counted? We assert that it cannot be infinite. It must have had a beginning. And our reasons for the assertion are these. Number 1. If it were infinite, the series would never have come down to A. Let us prove this. Let us go back to E, familiar to the eyes of our great-great-grandfathers. Was the series infinite when it reached E? There is as much or as little reason for saying that it was infinite then as for saying that it is infinite now. But if infinite then, not a single oak could have been added to it, for an infinite number cannot receive any addition. and therefore E could not have propagated its kind. And we should not now be contemplating A, which nevertheless stands before us in all its beauty. Therefore, the series was not infinite. There must have been a first oak, unproduced by any other. Number 2. Again, if the series were infinite, A would be the last of its race, and hence, by the way, would be an object of the greatest curiosity. But what an absurdity to suppose that an acorn falling from A might not produce a tree of the same species. The series of oaks was, therefore, not endless, and there was one tree that began the series. The reader will remember that we are dealing with a genealogy of oaks only as an illustration of a principle. And the principle is that no chain of causes and effects is possible unless there be a first cause, one unproduced by another. But if this principle is once fairly established, the conclusion is irresistible that if we trace the numerous series of causes and effects that have made the world what it is today back to the beginning, we must arrive at the first cause, which has not been produced by another. And now, having arrived at the first cause of things, we must evolve the idea of a first cause and exhibit what is logically contained in it. We shall see ultimately that the first cause is identical with the sovereign God, whose existence it is our purpose to prove. The first cause was not produced by another. How then are we to account for its existence? Did it produce itself? Or did it start out of nothingness of itself? Both questions are too absurd to be considered. If therefore the first cause was not produced either by itself or by anything else, we must conclude that it was not produced at all. Its existence is due to no manner of causation whatever, and hence we are forced to the further conclusion that it must have its reason for existing in its very nature. Its nature requires it to exist. But if its nature requires it to exist, it cannot be conceived as non-existent. In other words, it is eternal. This, by the way, is an answer to Darwin's feeble question: whence came the first cause, and how did it arise? And now a few further deductions. The first cause, as we have seen, exists by a necessity of its nature. But if a thing exists at all, it must have some determinate form or mode of existence. A thing does not exist in general, but as this or that in particular, and with a definite nature and definite attributes. Hence, when we ascribe essential and necessary existence to a being, we ascribe it to that being such as it is, and as having a certain nature and certain attributes. Hence, its nature and attributes, or all that it is, and whatever it is, partake of the same necessity as its existence. Therefore, such a being is immutable, for any change would make it different from what it necessarily and essentially is. Later on, we shall see other reasons why any change, whether in essentials or in accidentals, is impossible. At every step, we are getting a better glimpse of the wonderful ideas which are wrapped up in the one idea of the first cause. There are more to come. The next deduction is the most important of all. It is that the first cause must possess unlimited being or unlimited perfection. It must be infinite. We shall not rehearse here the more abstruse metaphysical proofs of this thesis. A few simpler considerations will suffice to show that the first cause is infinitely perfect. First, The very fact that it is a self-existent being is proof sufficient. What higher perfection is conceivable than that the very nature of a thing requires it to exist? Or to put it somewhat differently, what higher grade of existence can we conceive than that in virtue of which a thing possesses its being of itself from eternity? Among created beings, we admire a person who is in some degree independent of outside influences in the development of some personal perfection. When, for instance, he adds to his knowledge by thinking out for himself the solution of the most intricate problems. And the higher the perfection evolved, the greater our admiration. What then shall we say of that being which has, by a necessity of its nature, not any mere power of self-development, but that which, in any case, is the basis and groundwork of all actual perfection, even the highest, vis-a-vis actual being or existence? Any specific perfection, finite or infinite, in any being supposes the existence of that being, and hence existence or actual being must be the basis and condition of any perfection, even though it be infinite. Therefore, self-existence must itself be an infinite perfection. But no infinite perfection can exist in a finite being. Therefore, the first cause is infinite. In the second place, we can deduce the infinite perfection of the first cause from the nature of the act by which it brings things into existence. The first cause simply creates or produces things out of nothing. This may be argued from the very fact that it is the first cause. But the deduction will be made clearer at a later stage of the discussion. Now, any single act of creation is a proof of infinite power. For by infinite power, we mean power so great that no finite thing, no matter how perfect, and no degree of perfection in a thing are beyond its range. But the first cause confers upon the thing created its very being, and to create the very being of a thing argues greater power than to create any specific perfection in it. For the perfections or attributes of a thing are but modes of its being. Hence, no conceivable perfection in a thing exceeds the creative power of the first cause, and therefore its power is unlimited. Furthermore, if we limit the creative power of the first cause, we imply that some things are too great to be included within its range. But a little reflection will show that in this connection, greater and less are virtually one thing. No greater exercise of power is involved in the creation of greater things than in the creation of lesser. As to create is to produce out of nothing. There is no process to be gone through. There is no existing matter to work upon, and hence, creating is simply willing. Let there be light, and light was made. And consequently, so far as the creating agent is concerned, it is as easy to will a universe as to will a grain of sand. And on the side of the object to be created, the task of creating cannot be greater in one case than in another, as all things created are simply drawn from nothing, and are thus reduced to the same level. Therefore, there can be nothing so great or so perfect as to be beyond the creative power of the first cause. Therefore, its power is limitless or infinite. And here again, we can argue from an infinite attribute to an infinitude of being or of perfection. In the process we have been following thus far, we have traced all the series of changes that have taken place in the universe to their beginning and have arrived at the first cause in which all things have their origin. Now there is a class of atheists, certain materialists, who admit that there must have been a beginning of all change, but who are pleased to find the ultimate cause of all change in matter. They assume without proof that material substance existed from all eternity, uncaused and self-subsisting, needing no God to have created or preserved it or unfolded its energies, and having in itself the germ of all its future activities. But it will not be difficult to show that self-subsisting and self-evolving matter is an impossibility. First, it is impossible that matter could have evolved its own energies. For primeval self-existing matter must originally have been either in a state of rest or in a state of motion. If in a state of motion, there must have been a beginning of the motion. For motion from eternity involves all the absurdities included in the notion of an infinite series of causes and effects. Hence, our supposed primeval matter must have been originally in a quiescent state. Let us realize what this implies. Imagine a particle of primitive matter suspended in space, quiet, but capable of motion. What will set it in motion? The law of inertia is there to forbid it to move a fraction of an inch unless acted upon by some outside force. Primeval matter would therefore stand in need of some external cause of motion. And what we say of local motion is true of every form of activity and of every exertion of energy. It must have a beginning, and the beginning must originate from without. For in the first place, no exertion of energy in matter is possible without some local motion. But the local motion cannot be spontaneous, for the law of inertia forbids it. In the second place, and apart from the law of inertia, there is nothing in the attributes of matter that could enable it to exert its energies. Imagine a particle of quiescent matter a moment before its first display of energy. What can possibly determine it to act in the next moment rather than 5 minutes, or for that matter, 5 centuries later? Is it in the power of matter to choose the moment of its awakening from its eternal slumber? It would be puerile to suppose that matter was predetermined to act in some such way as the hammer of an alarm clock is predetermined to act by the winding and setting of the clock. In the case of the alarm clock, the alarm bell displays its energy at a certain moment, but its action supposes a continuous mechanical movement preceding and leading up to it, and even that would be impossible without the action of the human hand that wound up the clock. There is nothing in matter that can give the first impulse to its activities. The impulse must be imparted by one in whom mind and will make him independent of time, or to put it more accurately, enable him to make a beginning of time by setting things in motion. Matter, therefore, depends for its activity upon a sovereign artificer. But does it depend upon him also for its existence? May not matter have had an eternal and independent existence of its own? We answer no, because self-existence would be incompatible with its nature and its attributes. Self-existent matter must have had some determinate state or condition of existence. To begin with, it must have been either in a state of rest or in a state of motion. But we know that of itself, matter cannot determine its existing in either state. It is indifferent to either and must be set in motion or be brought to a state of rest by outside influences. But as it must be in either of the two states, and yet cannot of itself be in either, it cannot exist at all unless existence be given it by some external cause. It requires, in a word, to be created, and thus the first cause appears under the aspect of a creator. And what is true of rest in motion is true of other conditions of matter. Matter must be either in a solid, or in a liquid, or in a gaseous state. It must also be in a definite place. But matter is of itself indifferent to all these conditions taken severally, though by external causes it may be made to pass from one condition to another. Therefore, as self-existence would argue, self-determination as regards these conditions, matter cannot be self-existent and must have been created. In the second place, if matter were self-existent, it would be incapable of change, and yet we know it to be changeable from one form or condition to another. It must now be evident that the first cause possesses the nature and the attributes which we ascribe to God. It, or rather He, is self-existent and eternal. He is infinitely perfect, and is therefore infinitely powerful and infinitely wise or intelligent, though His infinite wisdom and power may be deduced also from the creative act. He is the creator of the visible universe, and is therefore its sovereign Lord and Master. That there can be only one such being is evident from the fact that He is infinite. The infinite must comprehend all being, and hence there can be but one who is infinite. In saying, however, that the infinite embraces all being, we must distinguish between two senses in which the proposition may be taken. To use the language of theologians, God contains all things in Himself, either formally, that is to say, as things are in themselves, or eminently, that is, in some higher or more excellent sense. Formally, He possesses all His own essential and infinite attributes. Eminently, He possesses the perfections belonging to created beings. If those perfections are of the spiritual order, He possesses them in an infinite degree and in a way that makes them one with His divine essence, which is not true of created things. Goodness, wisdom, and power, which may belong to created things, are possessed by God in an infinite degree and without any admixture of imperfection. The qualities of matter He cannot possess formally, as that would argue limitation and imperfection. But even these qualities, as well as all other attributes of finite things, may be said to be in God eminently, inasmuch as the eternal exemplars of things are conceived by the divine intelligence, and His omnipotence enables Him to bring them into existence. There is only one God, therefore, and only one Creator, and consequently only one source of finite being, whether of the spiritual or of the material order. But the argument from causation is not the only one by which God's existence is proved. The argument from design, as it is generally termed, is no less cogent. It is based on the order and beauty of the universe. Order, especially on a large scale, cannot be a result of chance, nor can it be produced by a blind and purposeless combination of forces. Order supposes a mind at work, and a mind working according to plan. Now, the presence of order in the world is easily observed. It is noticed, for instance, that many things work together for a common end, as for example, in the orderly recurrence of the seasons, a fact that includes so many interesting phenomena connected with the preservation of animal and vegetable life. Everywhere we see in things the purposes for which they were made. A study of the human body, for instance, reveals a wonderful adaptation of means to ends. Every organ being most aptly designed to serve a distinctive purpose of its own. The human eye alone furnishes overwhelming evidence of the presence of design. But a design supposes a designer. And here too we find that the great designer is not merely an artist working in materials ready to his hand. He gives things their very natures and all their properties. For in all the operations of nature that furnish evidence of design, there is a dependence on the natural properties of things, and the natural properties of things must be rooted in their natures. It is indeed by reason of the natural essences and qualities of things that nature works out her grand exhibitions of design. It is because the natures of things conspire so perfectly and so intimately with the general plan that they must be pronounced to have the same origin as the plan itself. The origin of all things and of their attributes must therefore be the first great cause whom we call God. So much, and indeed much more, which our limited space must exclude, does our reason tell us about the existence and the attributes of the Supreme Being. But reason is not our only teacher. God Himself has deigned to teach us by direct revelation. He has made Himself known to man from the very beginning, and the history of His revelation, carefully preserved, contains within itself its own credentials. The long but consistent narrative of the career of the chosen people given in the Bible, a people marvelously preserved in their purity of belief and worship amidst pagan surroundings, till led finally to the fullness of revelation in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, possesses an irresistible power of conviction to those who will take the pains to read it and ponder it in its entirety and compare it with any other history, sacred or profane. Promises fulfilled at the appointed time, this is the prevailing note heard in every part of the grand symphony, which finally reaches its climax in the wonderful life of the God-man. The life of Jesus, taken in its entire compass, and properly related to all that had gone before it, and to all that has happened since, has thus become the key to the world's history, and has confirmed in the minds of untold millions their faith in the existence of the infinite and eternal God.